Hey guys, welcome back to the Heart of Meditation podcast. This is your host Ricardo Ruan.
And I'm Ryan Burton.
And so today we have a special
Today is a special day because today we're gonna get to know our host, Ricardo, on a more personal level. I found that in a lot of cases that I've come across, people I've come across, the ones that always impressed me, or just the ones that were quite unique, they all came to the path. Um, they'll have a story. They'll have something very interesting that happened to them in their lives that put them into this whole spiritual dimension and spiritual way of living. So I just want to ask Ricardo how it all started and what it was like over the years and where he is now. So to start, Ricardo, how'd you even get into meditation? Now it's really popular. Everyone does it. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, however long ago it was when you started, how did you stumble into all of this?
So when I think about my life, it goes back to when I was in Catholic school. I remember reading the Bible, my little kid's Bible, and I would read the parts about Jesus and the story of Job a lot. And those were the ones that really stood out to me and how much I really wanted to be like them in a lot of ways about their faith, their commitment, their strive toward being a divinely person. When I was a teenager in high school, I completely lost all that. Well, even before that, when I was in middle school, I completely lost all traces of that side of me. It's until in late high school, when I was 16, I was hanging out with the wrong crowd. I was doing really dumb things, adolescent things that I cultivated this really deep anger for a lot of things, family, friends, for people actually. And I even remember one time telling my mom straight to her face, "Mom, I don't believe love exists." And it's not till I was 16 where I decided, okay, my anger issues are so bad. I wanted to find a way to heal myself. So I simply Googled what can help and deal with anger issues, and I found meditation. So Google the God helped me.
Nice.
And and ever since I was 16, I started meditating every day from that day. And there was one other experience that when I look back to where it was an interesting phenomenon. When I was 12, I I was very depressed. I was actually suicidal. I um I decided one day as a 12-year-old kid to actually hang myself. And so the day that I decided to do it, I remember I was in my room. I was journaling everything that was going to happen. I was writing like my farewell to everyone. And right before I was going to hang myself, I shout out, "Why God? Why Jesus?" And in that moment, picture the sun right in front of you. This radiating light, golden white light in front of you, and you can feel it radiating with love, compassion, and I just felt this way. I saw this in front of me, and it was just so compelling that I decided not to kill myself. And I can hear it. It didn't have words, but I can hear it say, "It is not your time. It's not your time." And so I think that at that point, it's sort of stumbled on to me being able to, I guess, access other things in my life later on. I mean, first of all, I was still alive. I mean, that's that was a blessing because I wouldn't have found meditation. I wouldn't have been on the best path that I'm on right now, which is meditation for people, for teaching people meditation. So those experience really changed me. It was just it was life changing. And right when I started meditating at 16, I hated it. Could only meditate for like 2 minutes to a minute straight, and I hated it. But for some reason, I kept on going. I kept on doing it. It was just something attractive about it. And at that time, and too, when I was in high school, I was not going out with any girls. I even told myself I will not have any girls. I will not have any girlfriends, only because I want to heal myself. So I was going about this constantly, just meditating, trying to understand myself, trying to gain insight. And for 10 years later, I'm still meditating. 10 years later, I'm still here.
It's such an interesting thought that you had when you were 16 that you wanted to work on yourself first before getting involved
Well,
intimately with somebody else. That's extremely unusual for a person of that age. But when that experience had happened to you, what did you think about it afterwards? Um, what did you how did you feel about that experience? Like, what did you think it was when it happened?
of like me starting to meditate when I was 16.
No, no, no. When the light appeared in the room.
Um, when I think about it, I mean, when the experience it right there and then I was just confused. I didn't know. I No one's ever really asked me this question, so it's a very like I'm thinking about it right now. Experience it right there. I was for a loss of words. It was really obviously like I told you life changing, and I felt numbed for a little while.
Huh.
I felt numbed because it was just there was a lot. It was like first I've had this huge weird blissful experience at the same moment where
It was in the darkest moment,
yeah,
right?
but it's almost like at my most vulnerable, I somehow was able to change. Because I remember at that moment, I started I stopped hanging out with the same crowd. I started doing things again that I enjoyed, which was play sports and be active. Because before I wasn't, and in the moment it was still very numb. It was a very numbing experience, but numbing in a weird good way. I can only describe it. Um, but the amount of bliss and like love and compassion this light had was just crazy. It was just it was just like bam. It was just it hit me.
Wow. Would you say it was? I mean, up until that point, did you believe that those sort of things were even possible, that they even existed?
Um, when I think about it, no. I mean,
Right.
I knew about Jesus and I knew about the miracles of that sort, but I didn't know a regular 12-year-old can ever experience something like that. I didn't have spiritual experiences like that before.
And from that point, because I think all of us as practitioners or people that have done this for a while, we could all look back to like these specific points in time where these pretty incredible things have happened. If that was what you'd consider your first um, mystical experience or spiritual experience, what would you say was your second, and when did that happen? How many years after that initial encounter passed?
So I would say when I was around 18. So
So
13,
an
14.
entire 6 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's when I really started solidifying in my meditation practice. At 18, I started meditating, I believe, about 8 hours a day.
A lot. Yeah, I
And
remember.
I started practice. I was really heavily influenced by Buddhism too. And I remember one of the first times where I was in a very deep emptiness state where everything really stopped. There was no sound, there was no person, there was nothing. And I was in this state for a while. It was actually scary. I remember experiencing this and I was like, this is scary. And being in there was something even profound because I felt happy, I felt bliss. But then my logical mind came into play and said, "Oh, you better get out of this because you don't know how long you're going to be in this."
So because we've been meditating and practicing together for years, I know I can recall chunks and pieces that were relevant in your spiritual life. And there's one that I wanted to bring up for the listeners because this is important. I think this one is definitely a theme that many of us fall into from the get go. Um, your teacher, or the man who's now your teacher, at one point he told you that you
Mm,
suffered from spiritual greed.
mm.
Could you get into that a little bit? Explain what he meant and how that affected you?
I believe so. My teacher, Master John Douglas, it was the second time I've ever met him, and he worked on me. I I'm trying to remember the context of why he told me I had spiritual greed. I think I told him something in the lines of how can I, or was it being celibate? No, I wasn't being celibate. I forgot the context of it for him to say this, but I remember him saying, "You have spiritual greed." And what that means is you've kind of created an ego and a desire and a selfishness in your spiritual practices where you wanted psychic abilities. I think I wanted him to like open certain things up, like chakras or something. So then he told me about this, and he was saying again, you you have spiritual greed, and it's actually hindering you. It's not cultivating love and kindness. It's actually dragging you down. And that actually hit me really hard because for a
Incredible.
long time, I was this monk. I was a monk at 19. I was a monk again at 22. I've been meditating for years prior. And I thought I knew the path already. I thought by meditating for 8 to 12 hours a day, I would get somewhere. I would start to open certain things up. I wanted psychic abilities, or I wanted to experience these spiritual awakenings, esoteric experiences. And to hear, oh yeah, you have a spiritual ego, you have spiritual greed, was really, it was hurt. It was hurtful. But see, I can, reflecting back, I can see how I was still a kid. I would say in my spiritual practice, I think I was 21. I believe I was 21. I would consider that myself as a kid in terms of spirituality, only because I had no real guidance prior to that. I was just meditating. I thought it was this, you do this for 8 hours a day, you're going to gain an outcome. When really the path is very fluid, and I didn't understand that there's no time behind our awakening process. And I thought I could just like expedite the time by just me constantly meditating, constantly just focusing on the object, my meditation object, and just forgetting about everything else. And so it was really hurtful for me to to hear that, because that was the last thing I wanted to have, is spiritual greed. But how much the ego can do this to you, even to regular practitioners. It may look like what you're doing is out of purity, which it is, but how much it can be corrupted over the time, because you're so attached to ideas, attached to your projections.
The interesting thing about this subject specifically, like spiritual greed and um and a spiritual ego, is that when we pick up a practice and when we start out on this path, basically what we're doing is trying to get to transcendence through self-centered activity. So transcendence, by that I mean the going beyond the self, um, or seeing through the illusion of self. Not non-duality is another word that we could use for transcendence, or
Mm,
they're different. What you can call it, whatever you want to call. But the point is, you can approach spiritual practice in a way that is entirely selfish, self-centered, self-aggrandizing, and egocentric, when your goal is actually something that has nothing to do with any of those concepts.
mm,
So like you're doing these practices, or you're meeting these teachers, or you're going to these studios, you're going on these retreats, and you're like accumulating, notches in your belt. You're accumulating these little trophies, these little ornaments along the way, and you think that if you put all of that together, yeah,
ornaments.
ornaments, you think if you put all that together, you actually have something. But the unfortunate part is that all of that stuff you've built up, all of that identification that we've began to do, that we have done, is the very thing itself
Mm. Well,
that is in the way
right, right.
of the actual awakening process.
It's funny because what it reminded me of when you said ornaments, it's like you're not supposed to create a tree out of this. But what we do is we're like, oh, that looks nice. This looks nice, and you decorate. First, you get a tree, which is like the foundation of what you've created in terms of your own spiritual practice, and then you design it all very nice and it looks pretty. But there wasn't a tree. There wasn't supposed to be a tree to begin with on the path, you know, like, and that's what I did. That's what that's what
That's what I think everyone does that, and everyone goes through that. But we all get to the point where we realize that the attachments we've built up in practice have become heavy over time. They begin to weigh us down. Actually, the attachment that we have towards the practice, the teacher, the path, our quote unquote progress along the way, we build up a lot of attachment to that, and over time it begins to weigh you down, and eventually, inevitably, you come to the conclusion that you have to let that go. And when you let it go, that's when the ball really starts to get
mm,
rolling. Because at least in the years prior, you did build up a lot of positive karma. You
mm-hmm.
built up a lot of merit. There's a lot of purification that happened in those years. So when that letting go, when that unbinding finally starts to happen, um, if the weights are not there, if the heaviness is not there to actually keep you bogged down, there's a lot that can open up. But it's a matter of actually being able to discern that clearly. And
Right. I for me, what it I should take my experience of when I almost killed myself as a lesson, because the way I changed after that was out of surrender and vulnerability. I was to that point where it's just like there was nothing else left, and then bam, change was there. And I think that's where, in terms of practice, we need to look at these things. You can logically understand your practice as being the highest. Oh, like, oh, this is my highest path. This is the highest path. But then once you start to understand more of the non-duality perspective, it's like you still have that seed of believing you and your practice are the highest path, but you may not notice it. It's still in the back of your mind. The only way it'll start to really change is if you get to that point of vulnerability and surrender, to be accepting to the fact that, oh, I still have this. It's all right. And you can start to alter and change it. But it's not a logical understanding of it. It's like at a very experiential level of understanding that phenomenon. And I remember John had gave this an example where he was watching a documentary about drug users, and I think it was in Oregon or Utah, some sort of state where they were allowing
So,
these
are they called self-use centers?
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, where they provide the needles and the space to actually
Exactly.
use the drugs in a safe environment.
And so, it's a very safe environment. But then there was a ex addict that was being interviewed, and he was giving his opinion on this, and he said, "Oh, he doesn't like it." And they asked him why, and he said, "The only way a person will get out of that state, get out of being an addict, is he needs to reach rock bottom." And that's almost what we're doing for ourselves. If we have an ego, and if we're constantly trying to get out of it, you're constantly going to be vulnerable or get to these moments of vulnerability and change. And then you go through a grief process. You know, you're letting go of something that you've identified with so much. You'll go through a grief process, a grieving process. But you have to be able to be willing to go that far, to challenge your own ego and your own mindset. But not I I mean, I thought I was doing that though. Here's the funny part. I thought I was doing that for a long time, but I wasn't. I wasn't. I had spiritual greed.
Yeah, it really seems that it unless a person is pretty bright and they have a lot of wisdom stored up or the merit to really recognize it or whatever it is, it's it seems to take time
Mm.
to get out of concepts.
Yep.
It seems that there takes a level of maturity in the practitioner to get beyond the conceptual dimension and labeling everything and reifying everything that they come to know in the mind. And the interesting thing about that is that as long as you're holding on to concepts and ideas, even your sense of self being an idea, even the idea that there's a you and there's a path and there's a goal, all of that, although it's existent in reality, when you're considering it, when I was considering it, when we're considering it at the level of ideas and thought forms and conceptualizations. And the interesting thing is, if this whole path is about freedom and if it's about
Hmm.
the highest love or if it's about enlightenment, then the very idea of being a person on a path immediately conditions you to time
Mm.
and form.
And it
And
starts to separate you.
by definition, if you are conditioned by time and form, you cannot be unconditioned. You
Mm.
cannot truly be free.
Right. And like I was like, it starts to separate you from everyone else. Oh, you and this path, there's something that separates you and other people.
Oh God, that thing's so insidious. That is so insidious, especially when you're at the outset. You start practicing a lot. You meet these teachers. You start doing this stuff, and you start looking at other people like they're a little lower than you.
Mm.
You know, oh, it's like, oh, okay,
Mm.
they're yeah, sure, but they're not spiritual
Right.
people, and I feel that that's a very dangerous
Yeah.
idea because that division exists entirely in your own mind. Like the thought that you had that okay, I'm this way and this person is that way. I'm a spiritual person, that's not a spiritual person. Fine, whatever. There could be truth in it. But the point is that whole process of differentiation and division is happening literally in your own head.
Right. But like we were talking about before, it's based on the moment we were born. You were born in a very separate way. Your name is Ryan.
Hmm.
Ryan is now having these types of personalities. Ryan likes these things. And from there, it just molds you to start to really separate you
And to
and
be that.
everything else. Yes, exactly. And to go from having all these things about you to nothing, you can understand where you can get lost. So, and in all these different paths, you can, there's so many ways to get lost. And like you were saying, it takes someone with wisdom, with, to me, also compassion and understanding
Hmm.
of loving thyself. But see, I didn't start to understand that aspect of loving yourself till later on, where it's like I have to love even the thought forms that are negative, start loving the thought forms that are positive, love everything about the experience of my meditation right here. And it doesn't matter if whether it was considered good meditation or bad meditation. It's still, there's something about it to learn and love. Again, everything we do is we constantly separate and conceptualize.
Yeah, before we wrap this up, I just wanted you to elaborate on that a little more because I've heard you say it about loving the parts of yourself that you hate or loving the parts of yourself that you don't want to acknowledge. So, we were just talking about non-duality and non-self, but now when it comes to actual psychological health and really working through the baggage that we know is there, what do you have to say about loving the parts of yourself that you don't want to look at?
So when we practice, for example, love and kindness for enemies, a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't have enemies." But try doing love and kindness for yourself, because sometimes the real enemy is the parts we don't see, the parts that we don't like to see, the dark side of the ego. And so during this process, we have to be willing to accept all sides of yourself, all sides. It doesn't matter if you consider it bad, horrible, even the thought process that you may see during your meditations of which it's violent or frustrating. The reason why you start to cultivate love and kindness for these parts of your mind is so you can start practicing that in the real world for people you may actually dislike, for the people you may actually find ill will toward. Imagine if you can just encompass love and kindness for the dark parts of yourself. How can you start to separate people that you may find?
Challenging.
Yes. And with me, when I was starting to do these practices of love and kindness for myself, obviously it was hard. I didn't want to accept that I was insecure. I didn't want to accept that I had spiritual greed. I didn't want to accept anything. I thought in my mind, I was a spiritual person who was already loving. Why? Because I was spiritual. Because I was lovey dovey.
By default.
Yes, but it wasn't the case. So it is important for us to love the thought forms and to go into a little bit more detail about it. When you practice non-duality, what is non-dual? It's unconditional love. There's nothing holding it with condition. Unconditional love is you love every single thing in existence. Doesn't matter if it's poop, doesn't matter if it's your favorite food, doesn't matter whether it's your loved one, doesn't matter if it's someone that you find ill will toward. Love encompasses all these things. It doesn't find anything that's separate, nor does non-duality. So
That's a great place to end. Yeah, thank you, Ricardo, and we all actually really appreciate hearing your personal story, and I know it's not always an easy thing to share. So thanks a lot for all that.
Oh, thank you.
All right, everyone. So thank you for listening to the Heart of Meditation podcast. We will catch you all on the next episode. I'm Ryan Burton, heading out.
This is Ricardo, and thank you guys for joining in, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.